So let's see if I can start bringing these different threads together into something coherent. So we've talked about sentimentality and how sentimentality exploits emotion apart from the real meaning and purpose of emotion. And we've talked a little bit about beauty and aesthetics. I'm going to move more toward that, but I want to just for you to understand the difference between what often is mistaken for art or beauty and what really is beautiful. And I mentioned before when I was talking about aesthetic experience that it has to do with sort of having the right response, whether it's emotional, bodily, and that is actually something that we have to train ourselves in, right? We have to discipline ourselves to have the right response. Or on the other hand, perhaps an easier way to understand this is the negative example. If people have been trained or taught to have the wrong responses to something, that can be very hard to correct. You know, if you think of like traumatic experiences or abuse, trauma theory actually has a lot to tell us about aesthetic experience, because a lot of what happens to the body as a response to trauma is bodily responses responding to trauma that is correct for that original experience, but maybe gets translated over to other situations where that is not warranted. But that's how powerful both beauty and trauma are. They affect our bodies. And so learning to discern and appreciate and draw our attention to the things that are good, true, and beautiful is something that we have to do intentionally. It's not something that really comes naturally to us. We have to learn. We have to, just as we acquire taste for good things like food or coffee, or other things, I don't know, that those are things that we acquire a taste for. And so it can be helpful to think about taste and beauty and morality, because taste is, we often think of it as with food or things that we experience with our senses, but we don't always think about taste. Well, maybe we do, having good aesthetic taste or good taste in music or good taste in art. To have that, most of us have to learn and to cultivate it. And when I teach, whenever I even just introductory lessons in literature to undergraduates or graduate students, I teach a course and have developed a course in poetics. And I talk about the difference between saying it is good and I like it, because one is objective and one is subjective. And the object of, or this goal or the purpose of us as human beings made in God's image should be that the things that are good are the things that we like, right? But that's not always the case. I will always like gummy bears, even if they aren't good for me. But I do think it's okay to enjoy, to indulge in them. But it's not good to like things that are bad or untrue or ugly or not beautiful. Now, and it might be going too far to say, and I do like to tease my freshmen with this question, to ask them, is bad taste a sin? You know, if we've walked through the whole, well, if it's good, and then we should like it, and if it's bad, we shouldn't like it. Well, does that mean that bad taste is a sin? It's something interesting to think about. I think there's, even if the answer is yes, there's a lot of latitude, right? Because because God created lots of different cultures and communities, and there are lots of ways we can express our place and our understanding in it. But it's an interesting question to think about. In his really interesting book titled "Good Taste, Bad Taste, and Christian Taste," Aesthetics and Religious Life, Frank Birch Brown examines the theological implications of taste. If you're into this subject, it's a really good book. I recommend it. Brown writes that taste plays a significant part in forming religious perceptions and identities, in creating and reinforcing religious differences, and in making possible a wide variety of religious and moral discernments and experiences. Matters of religion and morality cannot be reduced to aesthetics. Neither can aesthetics be reduced to religion and morality. But these spheres overlap and interact in ways that we have barely begun to appreciate, even if we have never heard directly of Kant's fateful compartmentalization of the good, true, and the beautiful, which is something I referenced before. So he's saying that there are overlapping spheres between our religious beliefs and our aesthetic tastes, even if they're not exactly the same. And so when he mentions Kant's good, the good, the true, and the beautiful, he's talking about the transcendentals, which is a very deep philosophical term, and I'll just kind of give my layperson's definition of the transcendentals. The people from the classical Christian schools have heard of truth, goodness, and beauty, and the transcendentals. And this idea comes primarily from Greek philosophy, but it also comes from Greek philosophy occurring at a time, really around the time when the incarnation took place. And there are theologians and philosophers who will point out that Christ came to earth at a precise moment in time and history when Greek philosophy and Hebrew history and the alphabet all were at kind of converged at a moment in time when language and literature could more quickly spread the good news of Christ in a way that the philosophers had sort of prepared the ground for. I mean, I'm putting a lot in that. But in other words, that Christ came at a perfect time, not just in human history, but in intellectual history and even the history of language to carry his ideas forth. So this idea of the transcendentals that comes from the Greek philosophers also is made much of in Aquinas and Augustine and other church fathers and throughout church history and even the Bible, I would argue, even though the language isn't always the same. But the transcendentals are basically the things that really need no defense or justification, no rationale. Not like Bunyan having to rationalize writing an allegory. The transcendentals just don't need any justification. Philosophers call them universal goods or ultimate values. Like, you don't have to explain why it's good to be good, or it's good to be true, or it's good to be beautiful. They just speak for themselves. They are ideal qualities for all things that exist. And so, and not just human beings and not just abstract qualities, but just if you have a chair, you want it to be a good, true chair. And being beautiful is nice too, right? If you have a dog, you want it to be a good dog, right? A true dog, whatever that means. And beautiful is good too, right? I mean, in its own way, there's a lot of latitude, but everything that exists, we want it to be good, true, and beautiful, and no one would argue otherwise. So let's talk a little bit about what beauty is, because according to the philosophers and theologians, they are separate things. Beauty, truth, and goodness are different, but you really can't have one apart from the other. If something is not good and true, it's also not beautiful. And if it's not beautiful and good, then it's also not true. Now, again, we might have to think about these terms in different ways to agree with that, but let's do that. So beauty, again, which is connected to truth and goodness, goes beyond the sentimental or the manipulative or whatever it might be. But it's easy to confuse the beautiful with the sentimental, I hope I've kind of shown, because they both are in some ways aesthetic experiences, right? The sentimental does cause a kind of emotional response. Beauty is a bodily experience. It causes a bodily response, but it has to also be connected to truth and goodness in order to be not just sentimentality. So at the most fundamental level, an aesthetic experience is an affective, with an A, an affective experience, one that moves us. To be moved by something is to, I get into this in my book too about how all language is metaphorical. And this is a good example. I say, oh, that was so moving. And when we use that word moving, we're probably using it metaphorically. But if we remember that all language is metaphorical and that even that expression, when we say something is moving, we use that word because what's actually happening, even if we don't feel it, is perhaps our heart is beating faster, or our breath is growing more shallow, or we get a tear in our body is actually moving in response to it, even if it's at a precognitive or subconscious level. So to be moved by something is to experience a bodily response. It could be any of those things. And sentimental art can move us or just evoke emotion, but not all movement is equal. And again, we could think of, and maybe we can do this in the question and answer time, but we can think about examples of the difference of just having a bodily response or being moved without that being connected to truth or goodness. And I've already brought up one of the most obvious examples in citing Flannery O'Connor. Pornography is a great example of something that can move, but not be connected to truth and goodness. And that's why O'Connor calls it a kind of sentimentality. The other thing, going back to the Greek word that I mentioned, kalan, that word is etymologically connected to the word call. And that is what the philosophers and theologians say that beauty does. Beauty calls us. It doesn't just move us. It calls us. It attracts us. It draws us near. A sunrise calls us. A sunset calls us. I didn't set my alarm quite early enough by choice to see the full eclipse. But I did see, as I was pulling into the airport parking lot, about a half of it. And it really was beautiful. I just had to stop and look up at it for a while there at like 3:30 in the morning and hope that the police were not looking at me suspiciously as I paused there before the airport to gaze up into the sky. But the things of beauty call us, whether it's the sunrise or the sunset or peony, my favorite, or my husband got called by a red Mustang convertible last summer, his dream car. And the impressionist paintings call us. The gorgeous man or woman calls us at the appropriate time in life, right? Aquinas defines beauty very simply as something which, upon being seen, pleases. Now, again, we go back to having to cultivate and train our desires and our tastes, right? Because if in our sinful nature we are pleased by seeing something that is not beautiful or not good or true, then the problem is in us. So in a way, I don't find his definition all that helpful when we dig below it. But still, on the surface, like if we see something beautiful and you see something and it pleases us, it's beautiful. It might not be the most beautiful or the best beautiful or all these other things, but that is what beauty does. It pleases. But he does get a little bit more specific, and this is where I find Aquinas really helpful. Because he identifies the properties of beauty as these three things. He's very Trinitarian. He says the properties of beauty are proportion, luminosity, and integrity. Proportion, luminosity, and integrity. Now, these words can get translated into different words, and they do. Proportion and integrity. So proportion, I think, really can't be translated another way, but just things need to be balanced correctly. And then luminosity also can be light. It has to do, there are different translations for it. I like the word luminosity, but just have enough light. And when you go to a museum and you look at a painting, you know, like a lot of what the effect the painting achieves is where the light is. That's what helps you to know what's important in the painting and not, where the light is, where it isn't. And integrity has to do, you know, it's not just like moral integrity, which obviously doesn't help us much when we're thinking about beauty, even though they're connected, but integrity in the sense of everything that is there, everything that needs to be there is there, and the things that don't need to be there aren't there. The way that this often shows up in teaching literature, and again, you know, my area of specialty is literature, and I'm trying to talk about beauty. So this has been my learning curve because. And I may have time to tell you my story about how I came to care about beauty, but you know, it's so fun to teach freshmen short stories because short stories are often very jarring and puzzling and weird, right? And so oftentimes the way a short story will end will be so puzzling because it won't, you know, tell you, it doesn't end in a neat bow, and students get frustrated. Well, what happened, or why isn't this there, or why isn't whatever information there? And the correct answer is always, when it's a good writer, is that if there's something you were looking for, some piece of information or a resolution that's not there, then that means the resolution is elsewhere. Everything that you need to know to understand what's in this story is there. You're just looking for the wrong thing or missed the important thing. So a good short story, in other words, no matter how jarring or weird, is going to have integrity, which means that the thing that we're supposed to be looking at something else that's in the story. And that's I think a good example of how integrity works. So, I know the question you're all wondering right now is, what does all of this have to do with evangelicals? And I'm so glad you asked, because I'm still trying to figure that out. So I do want to say a couple things about that, and hoping that all this history helps. I keep saying over and over and coming back to this idea of the pendulum swinging, right? Human history is a history of a pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other as one error is corrected and often overcorrected and then corrected again. And so if evangelicalism, when it arose in the 18th century, was an attempt to correct things that had been neglected, and so therefore to re-emphasize the need for individual conversion, the authority of the Bible in every believer's life, the importance of Christ's crucifixion and activism, if that was something that needed correction, we may be seeing a pendulum swing the other way in some areas, maybe a lot of areas. We'll leave some of that for the Q&A or for the after lecture coffee talk. Because I think there are lots of ways we're seeing some rebellion or correction, whatever you want to call it. But if evangelicals emphasized, and this came up in one of the questions, I think, the last time, if we have emphasized kind of the truth and the reason and the teaching of doctrine at the expense of aesthetic experience and mystery and wonder and beauty, if we have neglected that, then I do think the pendulum is, well, it is swinging the other way, but if it's not, it should be. So that's why we're here tonight. But I do think that we see evangelicals, especially younger ones, for me, that's most everybody, I guess, but younger ones who are expressing a thirst for more than the cheesy worship song that just repeats ad infinitum, the same words over and over, or the bad Christian movies that just, propagandize. I mean, the list goes on and on of the examples. I think we are seeing a hunger for really transcendent beauty, truth, and goodness that gets beyond the cliches and the bumper sticker mentality and the didacticism. I mean, we see this, it's just a little bit of irony for someone who is a literature scholar, that everyone thinks if you're Christian or evangelical, you must love Lewis and Tolkien. And I've they aren't even included in any canon in the academy. And so when I got to an evangelical institution and taught my first British literature survey that only went through the 18th century, and on my student evaluation, I got the comment that how could you teach a course in English literature and not teach Lewis or Tolkien? Well, first of all, we only went to the 18th century. But anyway, okay. So all of this to say that that it's just ironic. It's both good and ironic. So many evangelicals turn to Lewis and Tolkien, who are not evangelicals, or were not evangelicals, because they're so hungry for literature and for imagination and wonder. And I just want to say there are a lot of other writers out there that they're fine, but it's just like those are the only ones that evangelicals know about. So there is that hunger there. And so if we have emphasized orthodoxy and doctrine and right teaching, and that's been the focus, and teaching and preaching and discipleship, all those things are good, but beauty has its own kind of way of teaching and leading and calling. And for a long time, evangelicals have kind of treated beauty and aesthetics as though they are, are luxuries or unimportant or, or optional. But I don't think that's the case. Even, and I talk about this in my book, a Puritan worship space, which is characterized by being plain and unadorned, has its own profound kind of beauty. And its beauty actually reinforces what it believes by placing everything points toward the altar where the word is spoken, is preached and taught. And so the building itself and the architecture itself reflects the beliefs and values and teachings of that particular understanding of the Christian faith, just as a Catholic church building does the same. It reinforces what it teaches about beauty and images, and the Eastern Orthodox and their icons. These all have a purpose, and they uphold the doctrinal teaching. So beauty actually has an important place. Aesthetics has an important place. It's, if you have to pull up the folding chairs in the gym on a Sunday morning, well, I get that sometimes that has to happen, and it may be necessary, but it ought not to be ultimate. It ought to be the desired goal. So I do see the pendulum swinging. I'll point first to, because I'm always asked for examples. I'll point to my own work, just very humble efforts, most specifically not just the books that I write, but the fact that I was able to edit and annotate a 6-volume set of classic literature for a Christian publisher that came to me and asked me to do this. And it was so encouraging to realize that my specialty, my love of literature, not Christian literature, but just regular literature, could be used by the church and be taught from a Christian worldview and serve the church that way. And since I'm talking about that, I will tell a little bit of my story of how I got to this place where I cared so much about beauty, because it's very much rooted in my identity as an evangelical. So I was toward the end of my Ph.D. program at the State University of New York at Buffalo, which is, I don't know much about this campus here, but I'll assume, like my campus, it was very secular, and mine was actually at that time very hostile toward Christians, especially in English departments. That's they're not the most Christian-friendly places. I was the only Christian that I knew of in my program. I don't know if there were others who were hiding, but I don't think that there were. And I was taking a class. Actually, I think I was just auditing the class on. It was writing reviews. So it was a class where we were just. This was like before the age of the internet. So this was like when you actually had to submit things through through the mail to editors and so forth. Or maybe the internet was just coming out. But so we were being tasked with reading a book, writing a review, watching a film, writing a review. And I walked into class one day, and before the professor came in, my fellow classmates were just really frustrated, and and when the professor came in, they vented their frustrations on him, and they said, how can we judge whether this book was good or bad? There's no way to determine what's good or bad in art or literature. And it was at that moment the light bulb went on. Here I was a Christian. I was an evangelical. My professor knew I was a Christian. We'd had conversations about it. And I knew my students were wrong about making aesthetic judgments, because I knew that what they were really refusing to do was to make a moral judgment. And I know that they knew that they weren't the same thing, but I knew that because morally and ethically there is right and wrong and good and bad, I knew that there is right and wrong and good and bad in aesthetics too. Now it's a different basis, but I knew we can judge aesthetics. But I didn't know how to say it. I had no language. I had never read a single thing from a Christian by a Christian about answering that question as a Christian. So I left that classroom and did the only thing that I knew how to do, which was to call the office of the one Christian publication I would read regularly and ask to speak to the columnist who wrote about literature and art, and then was told that he didn't have an office there and that I could fax him. So I did. I faxed him, and I got pages and pages of faxes back with my questions, and he gave me language and understanding of how it is that we can, not just as Christians, but as human beings, make aesthetic judgments. And that was the start of my sort of lifelong quest to think about beauty and how to judge beauty. Now, there's a lot, that was almost 30 years ago. Fortunately, a lot more Christians today are grappling with those questions. There are lots of books and series and people thinking about them. But at that time, as a Christian, not on the internet, who was isolated, who didn't have any other Christian academics, let alone Christian academics dealing with these questions, I had no idea how to answer any of these questions. And I wanted to go back and share with my classmates some principles for how we can make aesthetic judgments. And so to be able to just even offer this kind of conversation, or edited classic works of literature from a Christian perspective to the world in service of the church is a huge blessing. I consider myself to be part of that little pendulum swing. A couple of other thinkers and writers that I would say, there are many more, but the ones that have been influential on me that I would point your attention to, and I've alluded to his ideas once tonight, and that's James K.A. Smith, who's a philosopher, and he has been the editor of Image magazine, so that's very much in the lane of these topics. But what I think he does that's been most influential for me and for many others is to talk about this way in which our habits and shape our desires, and our desires form us because we are liturgical creatures. So he talks about the liturgy of the shopping mall, and how that is set up to build our attention and form our habits in a certain way, and other habits and practices that we do that either draw us toward beauty or away from beauty, the way we train our attention. And one of his more famous mantras from Desiring the Kingdom, the first in the series of books, is, he says, and he's an Augustinian scholar, so everything he says sort of comes from Augustine. He says, we are desiring creatures before we are thinking creatures. And I think this gets to the heart of what it means to understand aesthetic experience. we are experiencing the aesthetics of a room, of body language, of the maps and roads around us and streets and communities we live in. Those are things that are forming and shaping us. Even just a lot's been written about this, the way certain housing developments get built so the garages are in the front and there are no porches. Those are material designs that form and shape us as human beings and our attention and shape our relationships or lack of relationships with our neighbors. So everything isn't just about the way we think about things, it's the way we perceive things, the way our attention is trained, and how that cultivates our desires. So I commend his work. My favorite current evangelical artist is Makoto Fujimura, who is an abstract painter who's very, if you follow him on any social media or read any of his books, he's very intentional about sharing his process and why he does the things that he does and how he uses precious metals and materials and takes a long time to create these gorgeous works of art that aren't representational. And that's another thing. Christians, evangelicals like pictures of things, but abstract art speaks to the aesthetic experience. All right, so I know we are out of time. I'm just going to give you a couple more points and then we'll have lots of questions, I hope. I guess I'll just point to how the word beatitudes is related to the word beautiful. It comes from the same Indo-European root. And Jesus, of course, we know he gives these blessings, these beatitudes on the Sermon of the Mount. And I think that if we heed those blessings, I think what he's saying, blessed are those, but I think he's also saying that beautiful will be the lives of those marked by meekness, mercy, mourning, peacefulness, purity, hunger for justice, and persecution for justice's sake. Those are things that are good and true, and they also make for a beautiful life, not just the sentimental one that makes us feel good, but one that serves, is the kind of beauty that we might not seek out, that might challenge us, but that serves as a refining fire to burn away impurities, to make precious metals shine. And then just when I'm going to quote Augustine, because I want to close with better words than mine. And this is a famous passage from Confessions where he says, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty, so ancient and so new. Late have I loved thee. Thou didst call and cry to me and break open my deafness. And thou didst send forth thy beams and shine upon me and chase away my blindness. Thou didst breathe fragrance upon me, and I drew in my breath and do not pant for thee. I tasted thee and now hunger and thirst for thee. Thou didst touch me, and I have burned for thy peace." Amen.